and begin talking a little bit about the fundamental documents of American political life, beginning with the Declaration of Independence. Okay? And I want to begin by posing this question to you. Why do you think that the Americans who declared their independence in 1776 from Britain thought that it was necessary to write a Declaration of Independence? Why not just declare your independence? Why not just take a vote in Congress, which, by the way, they did do on July the 2nd, 1776, in the Continental Congress. They took a vote. Some of you who know a little bit about your American history may know that there was a resolution before Congress introduced by Richard Henry Lee, the Virginian, who was a representative in Congress from Virginia, and it's called the Lee Resolution for Independence. And they took a vote on that on July 2nd, as I said. And do any of you like to just pleasure read? You like to read, like, historical stuff? There's a lot of stuff I could recommend to you, but since we're talking about this, maybe one thing I'll recommend to you when you have some time to do some pleasure reading, find yourself a collection of letters from John Adams to his wife Abigail Adams. Okay? From all accounts, they had a very sweet relationship. Okay? And in this period of time, of course, he was in Philadelphia, and she was back in Massachusetts, and obviously back then that would have been an extreme distance. Okay? It's not like hopping on a plane and going home for the weekend or something like that. So they were separated for quite a long period of time during this period, and he would write letters back to her, and she would write back to him. As I said, touching, sort of sweet, romantic letters. But there's one letter in particular where John Adams writes to Abigail that I just mentioned that to you since it's Valentine's Day. There's one letter in particular where he was writing to his wife that future generations of Americans will celebrate July the 2nd as the national independence holiday with all manner of pyrotechnic and celebratory. He was prophetic about that. He just got the date wrong. Okay? And some purists might say that we should be celebrating Independence Day on July the 2nd rather than July the 4th. And still other purists might say, no, what we ought to be doing is celebrating on September 17th. Because it's one thing to vote to declare your independence. It's another thing to write a declaration reflecting that the arguments, right, that compelled you to independence, as Jefferson said in the Declaration. It's another thing to actually achieve your independence, which that didn't happen until the Treaty of Paris was signed and Britain capitulated to the independence of America. Right? Anyway, Adams thought July the 2nd. Okay, so you have this question out there: why write a Declaration of Independence? Well, I think there's a very practical answer to that, grounded in the circumstances at the time. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you two reasons why they wrote that. That's the second of the two. Okay? So the first is a very practical answer grounded in the specific circumstances that they faced. Okay? You have to understand how Congress worked. Excuse me. How the Continental Congress worked. Second Continental Congress. Each colony had one vote. Not each representative or each delegate from each colony. Obviously, they decided within their delegations how to cast the vote for their colony, but Virginia had one vote, and South Carolina had one vote, and Georgia had one vote, and North Carolina had one vote, Pennsylvania had one vote, and New York had one vote. Right, each of the 13 colonies had a vote, okay? And the second point that you have to remember is that any resolution before Congress had to carry unanimously, okay? Including this independence resolution. And so if even one of the 13 colonies had begged out, said, no, we're not voting in favor, the cause of independence was dead. And there were some delegates in Congress who were very, very reluctant. The Americans, for the most part, were not radical revolutionaries. Okay? The Americans did not easily embrace the cause of revolution. They weren't like the French just a few years later. The American Revolution was not about destroying social class and privilege and They didn't go around, the Americans, like the French, didn't go around chopping off the heads of, the king and the queen and all that kind of stuff and trying to bring down aristocracy. The question was whether or not they would break the political ties with Britain. And many of them were very, very reluctant to go down that route. In fact, some of them never came around. And some of them refused, for example, to sign the Declaration of Independence. Okay? Some of them didn't sign it at the time. It was, not all those signatures. If you go to the national, the Smithsonian and look at the, Declaration of Independence, all those signatures didn't appear on there all at one time, all at one setting. It took a while to get all the signatures on there that are on there. Some of them never signed, as I said. Some of them, went to Canada. A delegate from Pennsylvania named John Dickinson couldn't bring himself to support the independence resolution, but once it was clear that that was the route they were going to go, he joined the Continental Army and served because he considered himself to be a patriot. Okay, so there are all kinds of individual stories, right? But my point to you is that, in 2020, we think back on that period and think, oh, they were all of one mind, like mine. Some of them were extremely reluctant, saw it as treason. Certainly that's the way the British saw it, as treason. So there was some question whether or not this independence resolution could carry unanimously. And so I think one reason that they wrote a declaration, they appointed a committee of 5, as you recall. Okay, the committee of 5 consisted of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, but the task fell principally to Jefferson to write this declaration, because he had a reputation of being very, very good with words. He was a wordsmith. So I said, Mr. Jefferson, go off and write a declaration. Don't rush. Don't hurry. Take your time. Okay. And that'll give Adams and Franklin and the others who were not busy writing an opportunity to convince and cajole some of these others who weren't quite yet on board with the independence resolution. I think it was quite simply, in the respect that we're talking about here, can be thought of as a stall tactic. It's a way to stall. But the other point that, I'm really sorry, Jacob, started to say Jason, but he's sitting right over there, sorry. The point that Jacob was making, I think, is really the more important point for our purpose. It's a statement of broad philosophical principles or ideals. Okay? The Americans understood, once they get to the point of making the decision to pursue independence, they understand that there's a really good chance that their efforts are going to fail. If you had been alive back in 1776, and there had been a Las Vegas, where you could go lay, you can lay a bet on anything in Las Vegas. Right? You can go lay a bet on the question of American independence. Smart money, as they say in the gambling world, which is about all I know. Smart money would have been on the British, right? Britain was the world superpower. The Americans were nothing. And the Americans were a bunch of farmers. Ragtag outfits, and Minutemen, militias, right? The British had a professional army, and a lot of firepower, and all that kind of stuff. So they understood that. They understood that they were up against it, and there was a good chance that not only they were going to fail, but that they were going to be hung for treason. So I think they write this Declaration of Independence in large part as a way to lay out, not only for their contemporaries, but for history, what their motivations were. Would they be remembered, would they be thought of by their contemporaries or remembered by history as just a bunch of malcontent colonists who didn't like paying taxes, just grumbled because they had to pay some taxes? Or would they be remembered as men of principle? I think they wanted to be remembered as men of principle. So if we look at the language of the Declaration of Independence itself, Okay, I'm going to come back to this here in just a second. But that's why Jefferson, in the opening paragraph, says, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. And then later in the document, he appeals to a candid world. Let the facts be submitted to a candid world. And then at the end of the document, he appeals to providence and so on, right? Like, there's this pretty clear indication from the pen of Thomas Jefferson, as edited by his colleagues in Congress, that they are really pretty concerned about how they're being perceived, because they understood that this was unprecedented. No colonies had ever declared independence from the country that had founded them and became an independent nation. Okay, so with that in mind, I think we can talk a little bit about what I like to refer to as the Declaration of American Ideals. If it helps you to understand the difference between the purposes of the Declaration of Independence and the purposes of the Constitution. And I mention this because people seem to get those two documents confused on a pretty regular basis. Okay? Even people who should know better. I hear people in, roles in our society that really you would think should know better. They'll quote a passage from one document and attribute it to the other. The Constitution says that all human beings are created equal and bound by their Creator. Well, you know what? That's not the Constitution. That's the Declaration of Independence. But it's more than just being able to accurately cite the document. Okay? It's really a matter of understanding what the purposes of the documents are. So the purpose of the Declaration of Independence is not to establish a new government. No new government is created as a result of the Declaration of Independence. No institutions of government are created. No authority is given to government. No government processes are set. Those are the tasks of constitution making. Okay? The purpose of the Declaration of Independence, aside from the immediate practical purpose of the stall tactic, is to lay out these broad philosophical principles. So, again, if it helps to understand that distinction between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, maybe refer to it, think of it as I do, it's the Declaration of American Ideals, the Declaration of American Principles. What are those principles? Well, there's four. Okay? First of all, as delineated by John Locke, the British philosopher, almost a century earlier, 90 years earlier, in the Second Treatise of Civil Government, human beings, by virtue of the fact that they are human beings, have certain rights. Among these are life, liberty, and property, or as Jefferson says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here is the actual language from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what took Locke a lot of verbiage in the Second Treatise of Civil Government, Jefferson condenses down to just this one short sentence. Okay? Second principle. By the way, this idea, Jefferson uses the word creator here, I think, deliberately. Okay? Why didn't he just say God? Yep. He was a deist. That's right. I think that's the accurate way to say it. There is some evidence that Jefferson had real reservations about the deity of Christ. Right? Some of you seem to be aware of that. Some of you may also be aware that Jefferson actually edited what Christians call the New Testament. The story is that he actually sat down, because they didn't have computers, obviously, to do this. He literally cut and pasted things. Like he took a knife and he cut out passages. All of the passages in what Christians call the New Testament that refer to the miracles of Christ or the deity of Christ, he took those out. It's called the Jefferson Bible. You can Google it, see that I'm not making that up. Okay? He thought Christianity posed good moral principles, it was a good moral philosophy, and that people ought to, strive to behave consistent with Christian morality, but he had serious questions about the deity of Christ. God become man. He was, a deist. Boy, I hadn't really intended to go into that. Deism is a philosophical notion that, how to say this simply? When God created the universe, if we want to start, whether the universe was created as a result of a supreme being, an entity that creates the universe, or whether it's the result of the Big Bang. They didn't have the notion of the Big Bang back then, but some other process that they would have was really irrelevant for people like Jefferson. The point was that there are these laws of nature, that the universe is a well-ordered. Remember, the Age of Enlightenment is not just the age of John Locke and Voltaire and Montesquieu and those people, those names that I introduced to you previously. It's also the age of Newton, Isaac Newton, right? Remember I told you that there's also developments in the natural sciences. So you have, during the Age of Enlightenment, this notion, this deist notion that grows up, that there are these laws of nature, these well-ordered laws of nature, like gravity or the laws of motion, but also one of them is the idea that human beings have certain rights. By virtue of the fact that you are created as a human being, you have certain rights. And that is as an immutable law of nature as the law of gravity is an immutable law of nature. And I'm not overstating that case. That was the idea behind, or of the Age of Enlightenment, but particularly deism. So you have this, these laws of nature that are operating out there. God is like the metaphor that's frequently given. Some of you have probably heard this before, is that God is like the clockmaker. Okay? God creates this, like the clockmaker creates all these elaborate wheels and pulleys and, all that sort of stuff. I don't even know what the parts of a clock would be, but imagine like a clock from the 18th century, right? How that might have been made. And then taps the pendulum into motion, and it just kind of runs on its own. It would be a pretty poor clock if the clockmaker had to keep sticking his finger in there and tapping the pendulum in order for it to keep time, right? God, in very much the same way, created the universe, right? Steps away from it and allows it to run its course. Put into place these laws of nature. So whether the American founders, were, as many people today want to say, they certainly weren't revivalists. They weren't like, what many people today would call fundamentalists. Jefferson, in particular, kind of get back on track of that. He had serious reservations about it. And, one might wonder, well, why? Why would Jefferson do that? And I think the simple answer, the best answer, I obviously can't speak for Mr. Jefferson, but I think that all the evidence we have is that he just thought it was contrary to reason. Remember, Age of Enlightenment is about application of human reason. It just didn't make sense to him, I think, right? A matter of reason. So some people would say, well, he was an atheist. I don't know if we can call him an atheist or not, but he was certainly a deist. That's the better term, deist. More accurate term. By the way, the little story, just to wrap that up, the little story I told you about the Jefferson Bible, Jefferson was vilified in his day for doing that. And he's vilified even today by many people for doing that and for his views on faith and religion and so on. Again, lots of letters that we can appeal to from the era. Jefferson's letters to, for example, Baptist ministers and so on. But today we know, for example, that in Texas, for example, there was a story in the news several years ago that I forgot what the agency is called that determines curricular content for various, courses of study in the public schools. Like what's going to be in the social studies curriculum, as they call it. I hate that phrase, that term, social studies. But what's going to be in the social studies curriculum? There was a big deal, national news, that whatever that agency is called, I forgot, took mentions of Jefferson and these ideas out of the curriculum, so that Texas children would be introduced to them. So there's some people to this day that are not Jefferson fans precisely because of his views on religion and faith. All right, so next is social contract theory. Here, Jefferson summarizing Locke. Again, what took Locke an entire volume to elaborate, to detail, Jefferson condenses down, not even to a complete sentence. Tells us something about government's legitimate purpose and the legitimate source of government's authority. So again, to appeal to the actual language of the Declaration of Independence, he says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's why we have government. That's government's purpose, to secure these rights. And he tells us something about the legitimate source of government's authority, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Okay, so we have social contract theory. And from social contract theory, there is the implication of limited government. Right? That's the passage that I just showed you. I won't go back to it again. But if Jefferson writes that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, that suggests a limit on government's authority. So beyond the powers that government needs to secure the rights and liberties of individuals, government's powers are limited. Right? All right, and then the last one that we're going to talk about right out of the gate on Monday, so we can get to the Constitution, is the right of revolution. Now, obviously, this is, for the circumstances that they're facing in 1776, this is the bottom line, right? So if any government breaks the contract, the people have a right to establish a new system, declare their independence, fight a war of rebellion, and if they're successful, establish their own system. That was the view of the Americans, that they were doing this independence thing not because they were just these radical revolutionaries, as I said earlier, but they were doing it because the king had broken the contract. You know how it is, how contracts work, right? If you enter into a contract with someone and they don't live up to their end of the contract, their obligations under the contract, you don't feel obligated to your part of the contract, right?